Power was never safe in the Middle Ages, not even for kings and queens. Behind every throne, hidden in the shadows of grand castles and whispered in the halls of nobility, there were plots so cunning, so ruthless, they could topple empires in a single night. Picture this: a trusted advisor slipping poison into a royal cup, a brother forging documents to steal a crown, or a spouse unraveling years of loyalty for a chance at absolute power. These weren't just stories. They were real, devastating betrayals that rewrote history. And today, we're pulling back the curtain on 24 of the most shocking betrayals that brought royal dynasties crashing down. What drives someone to betray the very person they swore to protect? Was it ambition, fear, or simply the intoxicating lure of power? The Middle Ages were a time when trust was fragile and loyalty was a gamble. A single act of treachery could erase generations of rule, leaving kingdoms in chaos and bloodlines severed forever. These betrayals weren't just personal. They were political earthquakes, reshaping borders, igniting wars, and determining who would sit on the throne. From the fall of mighty houses to the shocking downfalls of rulers who never saw it coming, each story is a lesson in how quickly fortune could turn. So why do these centuries-old betrayals still captivate us? Perhaps because they reveal the darkest corners of human nature, the lengths people will go to for power, the fragility of trust, and the high stakes of royal life. As we journey through these tales of deceit, you'll see how a whispered conspiracy could unravel an empire, how a broken vow could alter the fate of nations, and why, in the Game of Thrones, no one was ever truly safe. This isn't just history. It's in ambition, survival, and the price of betrayal. Stay with us, because the secrets of the past are about to come to light. In the Middle Ages, power wasn't just about crowns and thrones. It was a dangerous balancing act where one wrong move could mean disaster. Unlike modern governments with laws and institutions to stabilize rule, medieval kingdoms relied on personal loyalty, shifting alliances, and often brute force. A king's authority wasn't guaranteed by some grand constitution. It depended on the continued support of powerful nobles, the church, and even family members who might secretly covet the throne. Marriage treaties could forge peace between warring dynasties one day, only for those same unions to become deadly traps the next. Take the feudal system, for example. Lords pledged loyalty to their monarch in exchange for land and protection, but these oaths were only as strong as the self-interest behind them. A dissatisfied baron with enough soldiers could, and often did, turn against his king when the opportunity arose. And within royal families, the stakes were even higher. Brothers, uncles, and sons were natural rivals, waiting for any sign of weakness to make their move. Inheritance disputes, whispered rumors, or even the suspicion of disloyalty could spark deadly rivalries. The church, too, played a double game. Bishops and popes claimed divine authority, yet they weren't above manipulating kings for political gain. A well-timed excommunication could strip a ruler of legitimacy, while a holy war might conveniently remove an inconvenient monarch. In this world, trust was a luxury few could afford. Every advisor, every knight, even a ruler's own spouse could be hiding ambitions that would shatter a dynasty overnight. This was the reality of medieval power, a high-stakes chess game where the pieces could turn against you without warning. And when betrayal came, it rarely ended with just one life. Entire bloodlines were wiped out, borders redrawn, and histories rewritten. Understanding this fragility makes the betrayals to come even more shocking, because in the Middle Ages, no throne was ever truly secure. The year was 978, and England stood on the brink of chaos, all because of a mother's ambition. King Edward the Martyr was just a teenager when his reign was cut short by treachery. His stepmother, Queen, saw her own son as the rightful heir, and she was willing to do the unthinkable to make it happen. One fateful day, Edward arrived at Castle, expecting nothing more than a routine visit. But as he dismounted his horse, attendants loyal surrounded him. The young king never stood a chance. Stabbed in the back, his body was hastily buried in an unmarked grave, a grim symbol of how quickly power could be stolen. This wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a catastrophe for England. With Edward gone, later known as the Unready took the throne, though his nickname tells you everything about his disastrous rule. Weak and indecisive, he was utterly unprepared for the Viking raids that would soon hammer the kingdom. The very betrayal meant to secure his future instead left England vulnerable, its defenses crumbling under relentless attacks. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just the brutality, it's the calculation behind it. Didn't act in a fit of rage. She plotted, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And in doing so, she proved how little royal bloodlines truly mattered when ambition took hold. A mother's love for her son became a kingdom's downfall, showing just how fragile loyalty could be in the medieval world. But here's the real twist. History remembers Edward as a martyr, whilst name is forever tied to treachery. Even in death, Edward's legacy, his stepmother's schemes. His murder became a rallying cry for those who believed in justice, proof that some betrayals, no matter how carefully planned, could never truly erase the truth. And his reign became a cautionary tale of what happens when power is seized, not earned. The Vikings didn't just exploit England's weakness, they thrived on it, all because one woman dared to rewrite fate with a dagger's blade. England was supposed to be Matilda's. Her father, King Henry I, had named her his heir, an unprecedented move for a woman in the 12th century. But the moment Henry died in 1135, everything unraveled. Her cousin Stephen of, hungry for power, raced to London ahead of her, claiming the throne before Matilda could even react. The nobles, uneasy about swearing loyalty to a woman, quickly backed him. Just like that, her birthright was stolen, and England plunged into nearly 2 decades of bloody conflict known as the Anarchy. This wasn't just a power grab, it was a betrayal that exposed the deep prejudices of the medieval world. Matilda wasn't some unprepared figurehead. She was a seasoned ruler, raised in the courts of Europe and hardened by politics. Yet none of that mattered. Stephen and his allies weaponized her gender, spreading whispers that a woman couldn't lead men into battle or command respect. The same nobles who had pledged loyalty to her father now turned their backs, using tradition as an excuse for treachery. But Matilda refused to disappear. Rallying her supporters, she fought back, igniting a civil war that would tear England apart. Castles changed hands, towns were burned, and lawlessness spread like wildfire as both sides battled for control. At one point, Matilda even captured Stephen himself, holding him prisoner, only to lose her advantage when her own arrogance alienated key allies. The war became a brutal stalemate, proving just how costly betrayal could be. What makes this story so infuriating isn't just the injustice, it's how close Matilda came to winning. She had the better claim, the sharper mind, and even moments of triumph. Yet history remembers her not as England's first queen, but as a cautionary tale about ambition and gender. In the end, the conflict only ended when Matilda's son, Henry II, took the throne, stitching the kingdom back together. But the scars remained. The anarchy showed what happened when personal ambition overrode oaths, when prejudice trumped merit, and when betrayal left a kingdom bleeding for 19 long years. And here's the twist. Stephen's reign was just as unstable as his usurpation. His victory brought no peace, only exhaustion. By the time he died, even his supporters realized the price of their betrayal had been too high. Matilda may have lost the crown, but her legacy endured through her son, proof that even the deepest betrayals couldn't erase her line from history. The fourth made a gamble that would cost him everything and change the course of history. It was the year 1203, and the Fourth Crusade had gone disastrously off course. Desperate to reclaim Byzantium's throne from his usurping uncle, offered the Crusaders an irresistible deal. Help him seize power, and he'd fill their coffers with Byzantine gold, fund their war efforts, and even reunite the Eastern and Western churches. For an army stranded far from home and running low on supplies, it was a lifeline. They agreed, stormed Constantinople, and placed on the throne. But promises are one thing, delivering on them is another. The moment he took power, reality set in. Byzantium's treasury was nearly empty, drained by years of mismanagement and war. The people, already distrustful of Western interference, resented their new emperor's alliance with the Crusaders. When tried to raise taxes to pay his debts, riots erupted. The very nobles who had backed him now turned, seeing him as a puppet of foreign invaders. Within months, his own court orchestrated his downfall. Was seized, imprisoned, and strangled with a bowstring. A brutal end for a man who had bet everything on borrowed loyalty. But the betrayal didn't end with his death. The Crusaders, furious at being left unpaid and stranded, saw his murder as the final insult. If Byzantium wouldn't honor its debts, they'd take payment by force. In 1204, they turned on Constantinople itself, unleashing 3 days of destruction unlike anything the city had ever seen. Churches were looted, palaces burned, and countless treasures lost forever. The sack of Constantinople wasn't just a military action. It was a death blow to the Byzantine Empire's power. The empire would limp on for another 2 centuries, but its glory days were over. What makes this betrayal so tragic is how avoidable it was. His desperation blinded him to the risks. He overpromised, underestimating both his people's resentment and the Crusaders' ruthlessness. And in doing so, he didn't just lose his life. He doomed the empire he'd fought so hard to rule. The Crusaders, too, paid a price. Their diversion from the Holy Land tarnished the entire crusading movement, proving how easily holy war could twist into greed. This wasn't just a political miscalculation, it was a chain reaction of broken trust. Betrayed his people by relying on foreign swords. His people betrayed him by refusing to follow a compromised ruler. And the Crusaders betrayed their own cause by putting plunder above piety. In the end, no one won. The real victor, history itself, which remembers this moment as a warning. When ambition outpaces honesty, the fallout can reshape civilizations. King Edward II of England never learned the most important rule of monarchy. Personal feelings had no place in politics. His obsession with his favorite peers, wasn't just a harmless friendship, it was a ticking time bomb. From the moment Edward took the throne in 1307, he showered with titles, lands, and honors that should have gone to seasoned nobles. The king even gave him the prestigious title of Earl of Cornwall, a rank traditionally reserved for royalty. To Edward was witty, charming, and utterly loyal. To the barons, an arrogant upstart who had no business wielding such influence. The resentment simmered for years, flaunted his power, mocking the nobility with nicknames like Burstbelly for one particularly portly earl. He controlled access to the king, sidelining experienced advisors. And worst of all, Edward ignored every warning. When the barons demanded exile, the king reluctantly agreed, only to recall him months later, as if daring his enemies to act. That was the final straw. In 1312, a group of powerful nobles led by the Earl of Lancaster captured. There would be no trial, no royal pardon. After a hasty mock execution, his head rolled in the dirt at Hill, a grim message to Edward about the limits of royal favor. This wasn't just a murder, it was a political earthquake. The barons weren't merely killing a courtier, they were proving that even a king's closest allies weren't untouchable. Edward had gambled that his love for outweighed the rules of power, and the nobility responded with brutal clarity. The crown's authority depended on their consent. Yet the tragedy here isn't just death, it's how unnecessary it all was. Edward's stubbornness turned a manageable rivalry into a blood feud. By refusing to compromise, he forced the barons to choose between rebellion and humiliation. And in the end, his inability to balance personal loyalty with political reality would haunt his entire reign. The same nobles who killed would later depose Edward himself, locking him in a dungeon and allegedly murdering him with a red-hot poker. A grotesque end for a king who never understood that love, in medieval politics, was the most dangerous weakness of all. The lesson: power isn't about who you cherish, it's about who you can afford to ignore. Edward's fatal mistake was believing his crown made him invincible. But in the Middle Ages, even kings answered to the unspoken laws of the game. Cross the wrong people, and no title could save you or those you loved. Richard II of England learned the hard way that kingship wasn't a guarantee, it was a performance. And by 1399, he'd lost the audience. His reign had been of missteps, heavy taxes to fund his lavish court, erratic decisions that alienated the nobility, and a stubborn belief in his own divine right to rule. But the final straw came when he exiled his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, and seized the vast Lancastrian estates that rightfully belonged to him. It was a move that reeked of petty vengeance, and it handed Henry the perfect excuse to strike back. While Richard was distracted putting down a rebellion in Ireland, Henry returned to England under the guise of reclaiming his stolen inheritance. But this was no simple property dispute. The moment Henry set foot on English soil, disgruntled nobles flocked to his side, their grievances against Richard piling up like kindling. By the time Richard rushed back, it was too late. His support had evaporated. Cornered in Conway Castle, he was forced to surrender, not to an army, but to the reality that his reign was over. What followed was in political theater. Henry didn't just take the crown, he made Richard sign away his own kingship in a staged abdication, a humiliating spectacle designed to legitimize the coup. The document listed Richard's failings in brutal detail, painting him as unfit to rule. Then, with cold efficiency, Henry locked him away in Castle, where Richard would die months later, likely starved to death by his captors. A king who once dined on the finest dishes now wasted away in darkness. His death, as ignoble as his fall, was swift. But here, what makes this betrayal so pivotal? It wasn't just about Henry's ambition. It exposed the fragility of medieval kingship itself. Richard had clung to the idea that God alone anointed rulers, but Henry proved that power came from the consent of the powerful. And in shattering that divine illusion, he set a dangerous precedent. If a king could be deposed by his own cousin, what stopped others from trying the same? The answer came decades later, when the Wars of the Roses tore England apart. Henry's usurpation planted the seeds for that conflict, as rival branches of the royal family fought over who had the right to rule. The irony: Henry IV's own reign was plagued by rebellions, as if the act of betrayal had cursed his line. Richard's ghost haunted the Lancastrians, a reminder that no throne seized by force could ever truly feel secure. In the end, Richard's story is a warning about the price of arrogance. He mistook his crown for a shield, forgetting that even kings must negotiate, must listen, must earn loyalty. And Henry, he proved that ambition could rewrite history, but never without consequences. The Wars of the Roses didn't start with a battle. They started with a whisper, a hunger, and a cousin who dared to say, "Why not me? James I of Scotland should have been safe in his own monastery." But safety was an illusion for a king who dared to change the rules. By 1437, his ambitious reforms had made him powerful enemies. He'd clamped down on the nobility's lawlessness, seized back royal lands, and even imprisoned his own cousin for defying him. To James, this was justice. To the nobles, a direct threat to their privileges. And so, in the dead of winter, a band of conspirators led by his uncle, the Earl of, made their move. The scene was almost comically grim. A king hiding in a sewer tunnel beneath the monastery, betrayed by those who should have protected him. As James desperately upped floorboards to escape, the assassins cornered him. His queen tried to fight them off with her bare hands, breaking her fingers in the struggle. It didn't matter. They stabbed James over 30 times, leaving his body in that filthy passageway like a common criminal. The message was clear. No ruler was untouchable, no matter how bold his vision. But here, what makes this betrayal so tragic? James wasn't a tyrant. His reforms were working. He'd stabilized Scotland's economy, strengthened its legal system, and even built universities. Unlike other medieval kings who hoarded power for its own sake, James genuinely believed in creating a fairer kingdom. Yet that very idealism became his downfall. The nobles weren't just killing a man, they were slaughtering progress itself, proving how violently the old guard could resist change. The aftermath was chaos. With James dead, Scotland plunged into yet another regency for his 6-year-old son. The assassins, including, were eventually caught and executed in ways as brutal as their crime. One was boiled alive, another impaled on a stake. But the damage was done. James's murder didn't just end his life, it derailed his reforms for decades, leaving Scotland weaker and more divided. What's haunting about this story isn't just the violence, it's the lost potential. James had the rare qualities of a great medieval ruler: intelligence, vision, and the courage to challenge tradition. But in a world where power was measured in swords and grudges, his ideals meant nothing. The sewer tunnel where he died became a symbol of how low ambition could drag a nation. And for Scotland, the lesson was bitter. Sometimes, the price of progress was a king's blood. The third, better known as the Impaler, ruled with a grip so tight even his own blood couldn't be trusted. His reign was built on terror, forests of impaled enemies, brutal purges of disloyal nobles, and a reputation so fearsome it inspired the Dracula legend centuries later. But in 1462, his greatest threat didn't come from invading armies or rebellious peasants. It came from the one person who should have been his closest ally, his younger brother. Raised together as hostages in the Ottoman court, and had lived through the same humiliations, yet where emerged seething with hatred for their captors, adapted, even thrived. He converted to Islam, earned the Sultan's favor, and mastered the art of Ottoman politics. When reclaimed Walachia's throne and began his infamous campaigns against the Turks, saw an opportunity. The Sultan offered him a deal: overthrow your brother, and the throne is yours. What followed was in psychological warfare. Didn't just lead Ottoman troops against, he weaponized his brother's brutality. Own people, exhausted by years of war and terror, began defecting to side. Boyars who once feared impalement now saw as the lesser evil. Even military victories turned against him. His scorched earth tactics left Wallachia starving and vulnerable. By 1462, was trapped in his own fortress watching his support crumble. The twist, one without a decisive battle. His reign collapsed from within, his own methods used against him. The brother who had shared his childhood captivity became the architect of his downfall. His betrayal wasn't just personal, it exposed the fatal flaw in his rule. Fear could maintain power, but it couldn't create loyalty. And when the choice came between a tyrant and a traitor, Wallachia chose the traitor. His eventual return to power years later couldn't erase the lesson. His brother had proven that no ruler, no matter how ruthless, was immune to betrayal. His alliance with the Ottomans didn't just topple a king. It showed how external enemies could exploit family fractures to destabilize entire realms. And for the man who built his legacy on terror, the greatest horror of all was realizing that even his own blood could become his executioner. Queen Isabella of France was supposed to be Edward II's greatest ally, his queen, the mother of his heir, the living symbol of his dynasty's future. But by 1326, their marriage had become a slow-burning fuse of resentment. Edward's blatant favoritism toward his male favorites, first peers and later, left Isabella humiliated and sidelined. While Edward lavished lands and titles on, reducing Isabella's own income, she wasn't just angry, she was calculating. And when she left England for a diplomatic mission to France that year, she had no intention of returning as a docile wife. What happened next was less a betrayal than a meticulously plotted revolution. Isabella found an ally in Roger, a powerful baron who had escaped the Tower of London after rebelling against Edward and his corrupt rule. Together, they became lovers and co-conspirators, assembling an army of exiles and foreign mercenaries. But Isabella's genius wasn't just in gathering swords, it was in crafting a narrative. She framed her invasion as a mother's righteous crusade to free England from tyranny and protect her son's birthright. When she landed on English soil in 1326 with her 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, by her side, the public saw not a traitor, but a savior. Edward II's support crumbled almost instantly. Nobles who had tolerated his misrule now abandoned him, unwilling to fight for a king who had alienated even his own queen, was captured, gruesomely executed, and his body left on public display as a warning. Edward himself was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, becoming the first English monarch to be formally deposed. But Isabella weren't content with mere exile. Months later, Edward died under suspicious circumstances at Berkeley Castle, likely murdered on their orders, with rumors swirling that his end came by a red-hot poker, a grotesque symbol of how deeply his reign had burned those closest to him. The irony: Isabella's triumph contained the seeds of her own downfall. For 3 years, she ruled as facto monarchs, enriching themselves and ignoring the very reforms they had promised. But their arrogance bred resentment. When her son, now Edward III, turned 17, he staged his own coup, arresting and executing him for treason. Isabella was spared, likely out of filial piety, but her power was gone. This wasn't just a story of adultery or vengeance. It was in medieval realpolitik. Isabella weaponized her position as both queen and mother, proving that in a world where women were often pawns, the right pawn could checkmate a king. Yet her downfall also revealed the limits of such power. No one, not even a brilliant strategist like Isabella, could outrun the consequences of betrayal forever. In the end, the throne belonged to her son, and the cycle of distrust she helped create would haunt England for generations. The death of Zarevich in 1591 should have been a quiet tragedy, a young boy lost to an unfortunate accident. But in the shadowed halls of the Kremlin, nothing was ever that simple. Was the last son of Ivan the Terrible, a child with royal blood that threatened the ambitions of, the power behind Russia's throne. Whence body was discovered in the courtyard of his exile home inn, his throat slit, the official story claimed he'd fallen on a knife during an epileptic fit. Few believed it. The people whispered of assassins, of daggers in the night, of a plot orchestrated by himself to clear his path to power. And clear it did. With Gon became Tsar, his reign seemingly secure. But the stain of that betrayal never faded. For decades, Russia had been a tinderbox of Ivan's brutal legacy: purges, shattered boyar families, a populace drowning in fear. His death lit the fuse. Soon, a series of impostors emerged, each claiming to be the miraculously saved Zarevich, rallying peasants and disgruntled nobles alike. The first, the false, even seized Moscow with Polish backing, plunging Russia into the chaotic spiral known as the Time of Troubles. Famine, invasion, and followed, reducing the once mighty realm to a fractured wasteland. What makes this betrayal so pivotal isn't just the murder, it's how deeply it exploited Russia's fragile psyche. Wasn't merely a boy, he was a symbol of hope, the last pure heir of the Rurik dynasty. His death shattered the illusion of stability, proving that even the sacred blood of czars could be spilled for ambition. Might have won the throne, but his victory came at a cost no ruler could afford: the complete erosion of trust. The irony: his reign was marked by competence. He stabilized borders, reformed laws, and fed the starving during a terrible famine. Yet none of it mattered. The shadow of death hung over every decision, every decree. When himself died suddenly in 1605, many saw it as divine punishment. The time of troubles would rage for another 8 years, only ending when the Romanovs finally restored order. This wasn't just a crime of power. It was a lesson in the unintended consequences of treachery. had eliminated a child to secure a dynasty, but instead, he ignited an inferno that nearly consumed Russia whole. In the end, the real betrayal wasn't just against. It was against the very idea of Russia itself. Henry VI never stood a chance, not against the tides of war, not against his own fragile mind, and certainly not against the ruthless ambition of his Yorkist cousins. The Wars of the Roses had already torn England apart for decades by 1471, a vicious back and forth between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. But what happened next wasn't just another battle. It was a calculated annihilation. Henry, once a boy king who inherited the throne at just 9 months old, had grown into a passive, pious ruler more suited to prayer than politics. His bouts of mental instability left him catatonic for months at a time, turning the kingdom into a playground for scheming nobles. And the Yorkists, led by the formidable Edward IV, saw their opening. The betrayal unfolded with chilling precision. After years of shifting alliances, Edward's forces crushed the Lancastrians at the Battle of May 1471. Henry's only son, 17-year-old Edward of Westminster, was slaughtered on the battlefield, some say by Edward's own brother, the future Richard III. With the Lancastrian heir gone, Henry's fate was sealed. Captured and dragged back to the Tower of London, the deposed king conveniently died just weeks later. Officially, the cause was melancholy. But no one believed that. The whispers were unanimous. Henry had been murdered, likely smothered in his cell to ensure the Yorkist victory was absolute. This wasn't just a political assassination. It was. The House of Lancaster, which had ruled England for over 60 years, was extinguished in a single stroke. No heirs remained. No viable claimants lingered in exile. The Yorkists didn't just defeat their rivals, they erased them from history's ledger. Edward IV's triumph should have been the end of the conflict. But here's the cruel irony. The very ruthlessness that secured Yorkist dominance sowed the seeds of their eventual downfall. By killing Henry and his son, the Yorkists crossed a line. Medieval England had seen depositions before, but the deliberate eradication of an entire bloodline, that was something darker. The act haunted Edward's reign, fueling rebellions and undermining his legitimacy. And when his own brother Richard III later seized the throne from Edward's sons, the same violence came full circle. The princes in the tower vanished, just as Henry had. The lesson was brutal but clear. In the Wars of the Roses, betrayal wasn't a tactic. It was the only language anyone spoke. And Henry VI's tragic end proved that even a crown couldn't protect you when your enemies decided the rules no longer applied. The Yorkists won the battle that day, but the war's legacy of treachery would consume them too. No one emerged unstained, least of all the victors. Charles the Bold of Burgundy never imagined his ambition would be his undoing, until the snows of Nancy turned red with his blood. By 1477, he had spent years forging Burgundy into a European powerhouse, a kingdom in all but name, wedged between France and the Holy Roman Empire. His military campaigns were legendary, his court the richest north of the Alps. But his relentless aggression had made him dangerous enemies, and when he turned his sights on the Swiss Confederacy, he underestimated the one thing that could destroy him: the cold calculus of betrayal. The Swiss were supposed to be his allies, or at least neutral mercenaries he could buy. They had fought for him before, their famed pikemen a terror on the battlefield. But this time, money wasn't enough. Secretly, the Swiss had cut deals with his enemies, the French and who saw Burgundy's expansion as an existential threat. When Charles laid siege to Nancy in January, he expected a quick victory. Instead, he walked into a trap. The Swiss arrived not as reinforcements, but as executioners. The Battle of Nancy was less a fight than a slaughter. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Charles's forces were surrounded in the freezing mud. His cavalry charges, usually unstoppable, broke against the Swiss pike squares like waves on rock. Then came the moment that changed history. A lone Swiss halberdier struck Charles down, his body so mutilated it took days to identify. The man who had dreamed of a crown died nameless in the snow, his empire collapsing before his corpse was cold. The fallout was immediate and seismic. With no male heir, Burgundy's lands were carved up like a feast for vultures. France seized the duchy itself, while the Habsburgs grabbed the rich Netherlands through marriage. The balance of power in Europe shifted overnight, paving the way for the rise of Habsburg dominance. But the real lesson wasn't about territory, it was about trust. Charles had built his realm on borrowed loyalty, assuming mercenaries and uneasy allies would stay bought. The Swiss proved him wrong. What makes this betrayal so chilling is its inevitability. Charles had spent his life breaking promises to others. It was only a matter of time before someone returned the favor. His death didn't just end a dynasty. It exposed the fragility of power built on ambition alone. The Swiss didn't just kill a duke that day. They killed the very idea of Burgundy as a kingdom, leaving behind a warning etched in blood. No amount of gold can armor you against the knives of those you've used too often. George should have been a unifying force, a king who could bridge Bohemia's bitter religious divides. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about what happens when faith and politics collide. By the mid-15th century, Bohemia was a tinderbox. The Hussite movement, born from fiery calls for church reform, had split the kingdom between Catholics and reformers. George, a Hussite himself, took the throne in 1458, promising tolerance. He allowed Catholic nobles to keep their lands, permitted both forms of communion, and even secured papal recognition early in his reign. But in medieval Europe, religious compromise was often seen as weakness, and weakness invited betrayal. The turning point came when Pope Pius II revoked his support, declaring George a heretic in 1462. The papal bull wasn't just a spiritual condemnation, it was a political death sentence. Overnight, Catholic nobles who had grudgingly accepted George's rule now had divine permission to rebel. Even worse, the Pope urged neighboring Catholic rulers to invade, framing George's overthrow as a holy duty. Hungary's, once an ally, saw his chance. He allied with dissident Bohemian nobles, portraying himself as the Catholic savior sent to purge heresy. What makes this betrayal so devastating is how calculated it was. George hadn't persecuted Catholics. He'd bent over backward to accommodate them. But by branding him a heretic, the Pope turned his greatest strength, his moderation, into a liability. Reformers saw him as too soft on Rome, while Catholics viewed him as a wolf in sheep's clothing. Trapped between two irreconcilable factions, George watched his support evaporate. Towns that had prospered under his rule now barred their gates to his armies. Former advisors whispered behind his back, negotiating secret treaties with. Even his own son-in-law joined the rebellion, proving that no alliance was sacred when faith became a weapon. The war that followed was as brutal as it was unnecessary. George, though outnumbered, fought with the desperation of a man who knew history would judge him. He won battles but lost the narrative. His enemies controlled the story, painting him as a godless rebel against Christendom. By the time he died in 1471, exhausted and heartbroken, Bohemia was fractured beyond repair. Seized much of the kingdom, and the peace George had built lay in ruins. Here's the tragic irony. George's downfall wasn't caused by fanaticism, but by his refusal to be won. In a world where absolute loyalty was demanded, his attempts at balance made him enemies everywhere. The Pope didn't just betray George, he exposed how easily religious authority could be hijacked for raw political gain. And the nobles who abandoned him proved that when crowns and souls were at stake, even oaths sworn on the Bible meant nothing. George's story isn't just about a king's fall. It's a warning about what happens when faith stops being a matter of conscience and becomes just another chess piece in the Game of Thrones. Of Hohenstaufen never stood a chance, not against the armies of Charles of Anjou, not against the machinations of the papacy, and certainly not against the brutal politics of 13th century Italy. At just 16 years old, he was the last flickering hope of a dynasty that had once dominated the Holy Roman Empire. His grandfather, Frederick II, had been a legend, an emperor who challenged popes, championed science, and ruled an empire stretching from Germany to Sicily. But by 1268, the Hohenstaufen legacy had crumbled. His very existence was a threat, his bloodline a rallying cry for those still loyal to imperial rule, and that made him a target. When marched into Italy to reclaim his family's stolen kingdom of Sicily, he wasn't just leading an army, he was stepping into a trap. Charles of Anjou, installed as Sicily's ruler by the Pope, had spent years consolidating power, eliminating rivals, and ensuring the Hohenstaufens would never rise again. The two forces clashed at a battle that should have been his triumph. His knights broke through Anjou's lines early, sensing victory. But Charles had a reserve force hidden in the hills, a gambit straight from the annals of deception. When they struck, his exhausted troops were slaughtered. The young prince fled, only to be captured days later by a traitorous ally who sold him to Charles for a bag of gold. What followed wasn't just an execution. It was a spectacle designed to erase a bloodline. Was paraded through Naples in chains, then beheaded in the public square alongside his loyal friend Frederick of Baden. The message was unmistakable. This was the end. No more Hohenstaufens. No more imperial challengers to papal authority. Charles even stripped his body of its royal insignia before throwing it into an unmarked grave, as if trying to bury the very memory of his dynasty. But here, what makes this betrayal so haunting? It wasn't just about power. It was about fear. The papacy had spent decades locked in a deadly struggle with the Hohenstaufens, viewing them as existential threats to the church's temporal authority. His death wasn't merely political. It was almost sacramental, a ritual purification of the medieval order. By eliminating the last heir, Charles and his papal backers weren't just winning a war, they were rewriting the rules of the game. The age of emperors who dared to defy Rome was over. The irony? Charles's victory planted the seeds of his own downfall. The brutality of his execution turned the boy into a martyr. Within years, the Sicilian Vespers uprising would drive the Angevins from Sicily, fueled by resentment over his death. The papacy, too, would learn that no amount of bloodshed could permanently suppress the tensions between church and state. Story endures not as a footnote, but as a warning. In the medieval world, Even the most absolute victories could become tomorrow's rebellions. The sword that silenced a dynasty couldn't silence its legacy. John should have been invincible. After all, he was the Byzantine emperor who'd spent his life outmaneuvering crusader kings, Seljuk warlords, and scheming nobles. But in 1143, his greatest enemy wasn't waiting on a battlefield. It was standing at his bedside, holding a cup of medicine. The man John trusted with his health, his own court physician, had been bribed to slip poison into his treatment, a betrayal so intimate it sent shockwaves through an already fractured empire. The irony was crushing. John had been one of Byzantium's most capable rulers, a shrewd strategist who'd expanded its borders while keeping the chaos of the Second Crusade at arm's length. He understood the dangers of open enemies, but the treachery of a healer, that was a weapon he never saw coming. As the poison took hold during a hunting trip in Cilicia, the emperor's final moments were a blur of agony and disbelief. His trusted doctor, the man sworn to preserve life, had instead become the instrument of his demise. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just the act itself, it's the timing. The Byzantine Empire was at a crossroads, balancing fragile alliances with crusader states while fending off Turkish advances. John's death didn't just create a power vacuum, it shattered the careful equilibrium he'd built. His successor was capable but inexperienced, forced to navigate a web of threats without his father's seasoned guidance. Almost immediately, the empire's rivals pounced. The Principality of Antioch, long held in check by John's military prowess, rebelled. The Seljuks, sensing weakness, pushed deeper into Byzantine territory. Even internal factions seized the moment, testing the limits of authority. But here's the real tragedy. The physician's motive wasn't even ideological. No grand political cause, no personal vendetta, just greed. Some accounts suggest he was paid by nobles resentful of John's centralizing reforms. Others hint at foreign gold. Whatever the reason, the cost was catastrophic. A single act of venal treachery undid years of stability, proving how vulnerable even the strongest rulers were to the knives of those they relied on most. John's story is a grim lesson in the fragility of trust. In an era where courtiers and advisors were as dangerous as invading armies, vigilance wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. The physician's poison didn't just kill an emperor, it poisoned an empire's future, leaving Byzantium to face its greatest crises without the one man who might have steered it through. And for John, the twist was this: the healer who betrayed him didn't just end his life. He ensured the emperor's legacy would forever be shadowed by the question, what if King Philip IV of France didn't just betray the Knights Templar? He orchestrated their destruction with the precision of a military campaign. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had been Christendom's most formidable warriors, the elite guardians of pilgrims, and the keepers of vast wealth amassed through donations and banking prowess. But by 1307, their power had become a liability in the eyes of a king drowning in debt. Philip, nicknamed the Fair for his looks, but not his morals, saw an opportunity too tempting to ignore. The Templars, legendary riches could refill his empty coffers, and all it would take was a single, ruthless act of betrayal. The morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, dawned with shocking violence. Under Philip's orders, royal officials across France simultaneously arrested hundreds of Templars, including their Grand Master. The charges: heresy, blasphemy, and obscene rituals. Accusations so outlandish they would have been laughable if not for the king's iron grip on the legal process. Templars were dragged from their beds, tortured into confessing crimes they didn't commit, and paraded before a public eager for scandal. The trials were a farce, the evidence fabricated, but truth didn't matter. Philip had the Pope's reluctant compliance, the Church's fear of scandal, and the mob's bloodlust on his side. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just its scale. It's the cold efficiency with which Philip dismantled an institution once considered untouchable. The Templars weren't just warriors. They were monks, answerable directly to the Pope and sworn to God's service. Their loyalty should have been their shield. Yet Philip proved that no oath, no matter how sacred, was stronger than a king's hunger for gold. Under torture, knights confessed to spitting on the cross, denying Christ, and engaging in homosexual acts. Claims extracted through agony and later recanted, though it made no difference. Himself was burned at the stake in 1314, his final moments a defiant curse that allegedly doomed both Philip and the Pope to die within a year. The aftermath was as devastating as it was predictable. The Templars' wealth vanished into royal hands, their lands redistributed to Philip's allies, their legacy tarnished by lies. But the real casualty was trust itself. If a king could destroy the Church's own knights for profit, what institution was safe? The betrayal sent a ripple of paranoia through Europe, making rulers and religious orders alike question who might turn on them next. Philip's victory came at a cost he never anticipated. The Templars' banking network had stabilized European economies. Its collapse triggered financial chaos. And while the order was officially dissolved, its legend only grew, spawning myths of hidden treasure and secret survivors that endure to this day. The bitter irony: Philip's desperate cash grab barely dented his debts. The money was spent as quickly as it was stolen, leaving behind a kingdom no richer, but infinitely more cynical. In the end, the fall of the Templars wasn't just about greed, it was a warning. When power and money collide, even the holiest vows can be broken. And for Philip, history's judgment was merciless. The man who betrayed God's bankers became a cautionary tale of how quickly a crown could tarnish. The Third of Hungary never expected to be the last of his line. The dynasty had ruled Hungary for over 300 years, surviving Mongol invasions, civil wars, and endless power struggles. Yet in 1301, this ancient bloodline would meet its abrupt, suspicious end with his death. The official story claimed illness, but whispers filled the courts. Poison, a dagger in the dark, perhaps even a slow-acting toxin slipped into his wine by nobles who saw opportunity in his weakening grip. Whatever the truth, his passing wasn't just a tragedy. It was a political earthquake that tore Hungary apart. Here, why this betrayal cut so deep. Had no sons, and Hungary's laws on succession were murky at best. For ambitious nobles, this wasn't just a crisis, it was an invitation. Within months, rival factions backed their own claimants. The Angevins of Naples, the Habsburgs of Austria, even distant relatives with the faintest drop of blood. The kingdom fractured into warring camps, each willing to betray the other for a shot at the throne. Foreign powers circled like vultures, eager to exploit the chaos. The very nobles who had sworn loyalty to now auctioned their allegiance to the highest bidder, proving how quickly oaths dissolved when a dynasty's last breath faded. But the real tragedy wasn't just the betrayal, it was how preventable it all had been. wasn't a tyrant or a fool. He'd spent his reign trying to stabilize Hungary, reforming laws and curbing the excesses of the nobility. Yet in the end, his greatest failure was something no medieval king could control: biology. Without a clear heir, his life's work unraveled overnight. The nobles who might have defended his legacy instead became kingmakers, trading loyalty for land and titles. Hungary's golden age, built over centuries, crumbled in a single generation. The aftermath was in political opportunism. For decades, Hungary became a for proxy wars, its throne a prize fought over by foreign princes and scheming magnates. The once the unshakable pillars of Hungarian identity were reduced to a cautionary tale. Their fall proved a brutal truth. In medieval Europe, dynasties didn't just need strength or wisdom to survive, they needed luck. One untimely death, one missing heir, and everything could collapse. Story isn't just about murder or conspiracy. It's about the fragility of power when loyalty is conditional. The nobles who betrayed him didn't just kill a king, they killed the idea of Hungary itself, leaving a vacuum that would take centuries to fill. And their legacy became a ghost, haunting every future ruler who dared to believe their throne was secure. The invitation seemed like an honor, a royal feast at Edinburgh Castle for the young Earl of and his brother. They were just boys, 16 and 10 years old, heirs to one of Scotland's most powerful noble families. King James II, barely older than them at 11, had extended the gesture in good faith, or so it appeared. The clan had been a thorn in the crown's side for decades, their lands vast, their armies formidable, their loyalty questionable. But this was supposed to be a fresh start. The boys arrived expecting music, fine food, the warmth of a king's favor. Instead, they walked into a trap that would become legendary for its cruelty. The feast began normally enough. Servants carried in platters of roasted meats, goblets brimming with wine. Laughter echoed through the hall. Then, without warning, a black bull's head was placed on the table, a medieval symbol of death. The room fell silent. Armed guards seized the brothers, dragging them into the courtyard as the king watched, powerless or complicit. History still debates which. There, beneath the cold Scottish sky, the boys were given a mock trial before being beheaded. Their crime: the unproven suspicion that their family might one day challenge the throne. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just the brutality, it's the calculated use of hospitality as a weapon. In medieval Europe, sharing bread was sacred, a guest's safety guaranteed by tradition. The Black Dinner didn't just break that code, it weaponized it. The message was clear: no law, no oath, not even the bonds of fellowship could protect you from a king's paranoia. And for James, the payoff was immediate. With the heirs gone, their clan's power fractured. Lands were confiscated, allies scattered. But the cost? A stain on his reign that never faded. The aftermath rippled far beyond that bloody courtyard. The Black Dinner became a byword for royal treachery, a story whispered in noble halls for generations. It inspired similar betrayals, like the infamous massacre of centuries later. And for the family, it forged a legacy of defiance. Within years, a new earl rose, vowing never to trust a king's promises again. The very act meant to crush rebellion instead fueled it, proving that violence might win battles, but it rarely won loyalty. Here's the cruel irony. James II spent his life trying to outrun the shadow of that night. He grew into a capable ruler, even beloved by some. But history remembers him first as the boy king who let children die at his table. The Black Dinner wasn't just a political gambit. It was a lesson in how quickly fear can corrupt power. And for Scotland, it became a warning. Trust no crown that feasts with its enemies. Some betrayals don't just end lives. They redefine what's possible, leaving every future invitation laced with doubt. Richard III rode into battle at field with every reason to believe victory was his. The year was 1485, and his forces outnumbered Henry Tudor's ragtag army of exiles and mercenaries. The crown literally sat upon his head as he fought, proof of his confidence. But wars aren't won by numbers alone. They're won by loyalty. And in that crucial moment, Richard learned just how fragile loyalty could be. Lord Stanley was supposed to be his ally, a powerful noble whose support Richard had secured by taking his son hostage. But Stanley had other plans. As the battle raged, his forces stood motionless on the sidelines, watching, waiting. Then, at the decisive moment, they turned. Stanley's knights charged not for Richard, but for Henry. That single betrayal shattered the Plantagenet dynasty. Abandoned by his own men, Richard fought desperately, his famous cry of treason. Lost in the chaos before he was cut down. The crown he'd worn into battle rolled under a hawthorn bush, only to be placed on Henry Tudor's head. History would remember this as the birth of a new era. But for Richard, it was the end of everything. What makes this betrayal so devastating isn't just the act itself. It's how perfectly it exploited Richard's greatest weakness. His reign had always been shadowed by rumors. The disappearance of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, haunted his reputation. Many nobles tolerated him out of fear, not faith. Stanley knew this. So when he chose Henry, he wasn't just switching sides, he was betting on the future. Henry promised stability, marriage alliances, a clean break from the Wars of the Roses. Richard, for all his battlefield prowess, could never offer that. The aftermath rewrote England's story. Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York united the warring factions, symbolically healing decades of division. The Tudors would go on to rule for over a century, reshaping England's religion, culture, and global standing. Meanwhile, Richard's body was thrown into an unmarked grave, his legacy left to the mercy of Tudor historians who painted him as a monster. But here's the bitter twist. Stanley's betrayal didn't just doom Richard, it doomed the very nobility that enabled it. Henry, wary of turncoats, spent his reign weakening the barons who'd made him king. The age of overmighty subjects choosing kings was ending. Stanley himself would later learn this the hard way when his own son was executed for treason. Wasn't just a battle. It was a lesson in the price of betrayal, and the irony that those who profit from it rarely escape its consequences. Richard lost his life, but Stanley's descendants lost a world where nobles held the power to make or break kings. In the end, the real victor was Henry or even the Tudors. It was the idea that loyalty, once broken, can never truly be bought again. The Romanov dynasty's rise to power in Russia was built on a foundation of blood, a truth that would echo tragically through the centuries. In 1613, a young boy named Ivan, just 4 years old, became the unwitting pawn in a deadly game of thrones. He was the last surviving heir of the Rurik dynasty, the ancient bloodline that had ruled Russia for over 700 years. With the time of troubles ravaging the country, rival factions saw Ivan as both a threat and an opportunity. The Romanovs, then a rising noble family, backed the boy's claim briefly, until they realized securing their own future meant eliminating his. The details of Ivan's death remain shrouded in whispers. Some accounts claim he was hanged, others say stabbed or smothered. What's undeniable is that his murder cleared the path for 16-year-old Michael Romanov's coronation, founding a dynasty that would rule Russia for 300 years. The irony is almost too cruel to fathom. The Romanovs began their reign by silencing a child, only to meet their own end in a hail of bullets aimed at another innocent boy, Zarevich, in 1918. History has a way of balancing its scales. This betrayal wasn't just about power, it was about legacy. By erasing the Rurik line, the Romanovs weren't merely seizing the throne, they were rewriting Russia's origin story. Michael's supporters framed his ascension as a divine solution to the chaos, a people's choice blessed by God. But the stain never fully faded. For generations, pretenders claiming to be Ivan's descendants would emerge, their very existence a reminder that the Romanov crown rested on stolen ground. The parallel to their downfall is haunting. Just as they'd liquidated the Ruriks to secure their future, the Bolsheviks would later exterminate Nicholas II's family to erase theirs. The Romanovs, who began by betraying a child's trust, ultimately became victims of the same ruthless calculus. Perhaps that's why Ivan's story lingers, not as ancient history, but as a dark mirror. Dynasties that claw their way to power through the young and defenseless rarely outrun the shadows of those first sins. In the end, the Romanovs didn't just inherit a throne. They inherited a curse. The Umayyids never saw it coming. The very people they ruled for nearly a century turned on them with a brutality that rewrote the map of the Islamic world. By 750, their empire stretched from Spain to India, a golden age of conquest and cultural flourishing. But beneath the surface, resentment festered. The Umayyids had grown complacent, favoring Arab elites over converted Muslims, hoarding wealth in Damascus, while distant provinces chafed under their rule. And in the shadows, the Abbasids, descendants of the Prophet's uncle, were patiently weaving a web of rebellion, promising equality, justice, and a return to pious rule. The revolution began with whispers in Persia, where disgruntled soldiers and marginalized scholars under the Abbasids black banners. What started as scattered uprisings soon became a wildfire. The Umayyad governor was overthrown, his head sent to the rebels as a trophy. By the time Caliph II realized the scale of the threat, it was too late. At the Battle of his forces crumbled against the Abbasid onslaught, their once loyal Syrian troops abandoning them mid-battle. The message was clear. The Umayyids had lost the people's faith. What followed wasn't just a regime change, it was an extermination. The Abbasids invited the Umayyad princes to a feast of reconciliation in the city of, a gesture of peace. But when the guests arrived, they were clubbed to death one by one, their bodies wrapped in carpets and left to rot. Only one prince, Abd al, escaped the slaughter, fleeing across North Africa in a desperate race for survival. His journey would end in Spain, where he carved out a new Umayyad kingdom in exile, a shimmering echo of the dynasty's former glory. The Abbasids didn't just seize power, they erased the Umayyids from history. Damascus was abandoned as the capital, its palaces left to crumble. The new rulers built Baghdad as a symbol of their rebirth, a melting pot of cultures and ideas far removed from Umayyad elitism. Yet for all their promises, the Abbasids soon mirrored the corruption they'd overthrown. The revolution's ideals faded, leaving only the stark lesson that no dynasty, no matter how mighty, was safe from the whirlwind of betrayal. And for Abd al, his survival became legend. The lone fugitive prince transformed Al into a beacon of learning and tolerance, proving that even the most crushing defeats could birth new beginnings. The Umayyids fell, but their legacy, like the echoes of their blood-stained banquet hall, would never fully fade. Harold's crown was already slipping when his own brother reached for it. The year 1066 was supposed to be England's triumph, a chance for the last Saxon king to prove his worth. Instead, it became in how family betrayal can unravel a kingdom at the worst possible moment. Had once ruled Northumbria, but his harsh taxes and brutal reprisals against dissenters made him so hated that the northern nobles revolted, forcing Harold, then just the king's right hand, to exile his own brother to save the realm. That decision would come back to haunt them both. Exile did humble, it enraged him. For years, he plotted his return, scouring Europe for allies willing to help him seize what he saw as his birthright. When he finally struck a deal with the Norwegian king, it wasn't just an alliance, it was a personal vendetta dressed as a war. In September 1066, their combined forces landed in Yorkshire, catching Harold off guard. The timing couldn't have been worse. William of Normandy was massing his own invasion fleet across the Channel, and Harold's army was stretched thin. Yet didn't care about England's survival, only his revenge. The Battle of Stamford Bridge should have been Harold's finest hour. His forced march north, covering nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, was a feat of medieval logistics. His troops annihilated the Norwegians, killing and shattering the invading army. But the victory came at a catastrophic cost. Died on that battlefield, his betrayal ending in the mud alongside the foreign king he'd brought to England's shores. Worse, the battle drained Harold's forces just as William's ships finally landed in the south. History remembers Hastings as the moment England changed forever. But the real turning point was treachery. Without his brother's invasion, Harold might have been rested, his army intact, his defenses ready. Instead, his exhausted troops stumbled into William's ambush, their shields lowered, their ranks broken. A single family feud had tipped the scales, proof that in the medieval world, even blood ties could snap under the weight of ambition. Twist. Betrayal didn't just kill two brothers, it killed an era. With Harold's death, Saxon rule collapsed and Norman dominance began. The England that emerged with its castles, its French-speaking nobility, its rewritten laws, bore little resemblance to the kingdom had tried to claim. His legacy wasn't a crown, but a cautionary tale. When personal grudges override loyalty, everyone loses. The last Saxon king fell not just to foreign arrows, but to the knife of kinship twisted against him. The Tower of London was supposed to be a temporary sanctuary, a place where 12-year-old Edward V and his younger brother Richard could safely await the boy king's coronation. Instead, it became their prison, then their tomb. The year was 1483, and their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been appointed their protector. But protection wasn't what he had in mind. Within weeks, Richard declared the boys illegitimate, claiming their father's marriage was invalid. Parliament rubber-stamped his audacious power grab, and Richard III crowned himself king. The princes vanished from public view, their faces fading like ghosts from the tower's windows. What makes this betrayal so haunting isn't just the crime, it's the chilling efficiency with which Richard rewrote reality. He didn't just seize power, he weaponized doubt, turning a loving marriage into a scandal and innocent children into obstacles. The boy's mother, Elizabeth, fled into sanctuary, her frantic letters begging for help that never came. Meanwhile, Richard's allies spread whispers. The princes were sickly, perhaps already dead of natural causes. By the time anyone dared demand proof of their survival, it was too late. The tower's stones kept their secrets well. Theories about their fate have fueled debates for over 500 years. Some argue they died of illness, others that Henry VII had them killed after. But the most damning evidence came in 1674, when workers renovating the tower discovered a wooden chest beneath a staircase. Inside, the skeletons of 2 children. Their small bones told no tales, but the timing, the location, and the whispers of the past pointed to one grim conclusion. Richard had ordered their deaths to secure his throne. Yet here's the twist that still divides historians. Richard's reign was shockingly competent. He passed progressive laws, championed the poor, and governed with surprising fairness. If he did kill his nephews, it wasn't the act of a mindless monster. It was the cold calculus of a man who believed removing 2 boys could prevent another civil war. That doesn't excuse the act, but it exposes the brutal logic of medieval power. To Richard, the princes weren't family. They were political liabilities. The legacy of this betrayal echoes far beyond those vanished children. Shakespeare immortalized Richard as a hunchbacked villain, while Tudor historians painted him as the ultimate usurper. But the real tragedy lies in what their deaths symbolized. The moment bloodlines stopped being sacred. If a king could kill his own kin for a crown, what hope was there for mercy in the wars to come? The prince's fate became a warning etched in history's darkest ink. That no one, not even a child, was safe when a throne was at stake. And for Richard, the crown he won with their blood bought him only 2 years of rule before he too fell in battle, his name forever tied to the shadows of the tower. The princes may have lost their lives, but Richard lost something far harder to reclaim, his place in history. Some betrayals don't just end lives, they define them. Maria had spent his life playing the game of power with ruthless precision. Yet in the end, even he couldn't outmaneuver fate. The last of the dynasty ruled Milan with a mix of paranoia and brilliance, trusting no one but his mercenaries to keep his enemies at bay. And why wouldn't he? Condottieri were professionals, their loyalty bought and paid for in gold. But gold, as would discover too late, couldn't buy legacy. When the Duke died childless in 1447, Milan held its breath. The name had dominated northern Italy for nearly 2 centuries, their serpent crest etched into castles, coins, and the very psyche of the region. Yet without an heir, that legacy hung by a thread, and the man had relied on to defend his throne saw his chance. They didn't just abandon his employer's cause. He turned his army against the city he'd sworn to protect, besieging Milan until its starving council had no choice but to surrender. Within 3 years, wasn't just a hired sword, he was Duke, his marriage to his illegitimate daughter giving his coup a thin veneer of legitimacy. The betrayal was as pragmatic as it was brutal. Didn't act out of personal hatred. He simply recognized that Milan was a prize ripe for the taking. His mistake wasn't underestimating his mercenaries' ambition. It was assuming that money could replace blood. In the fractured world of Renaissance Italy, where city-states rose and fell on the strength of their rulers, Dynasties lived and died by the sword. They had built their empire through war, marriage, and sheer force of will. It was almost poetic that their end came not in battle, but in the cold calculus of a man who realized loyalty was just another contract to be broken. Yet the twist was treachery. It was how thoroughly he eclipsed the dynasty he'd erased. Under his rule, Milan flourished, becoming a beacon of Renaissance art and culture. The name would endure for generations, while they faded into history, their serpent emblem replaced by a new family's crest. Story is a reminder that in the medieval world, even the mightiest dynasties were just one betrayal away from oblivion. And for the condottieri who held their swords, the lesson was clear. Sometimes the greatest rewards came not from serving kings, but from becoming them. Christian II of Denmark didn't just lose Sweden, he turned his own coronation into a slaughterhouse. The Union, that fragile alliance binding Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under one crown, had always been more aspiration than reality. By 1520, after years of Swedish resistance, Christian was determined to crush dissent once and for all. His solution: a wedding. Inviting Sweden's nobility to his coronation in Stockholm, he offered amnesty, lavish feasts, the promise of unity. What he delivered was something far darker. For 3 days, the celebrations unfolded without a hint of what was coming. Then, without warning, Christian soldiers barred the doors of the Great Hall. The king accused the gathered nobles of heresy, treason, crimes against the crown. The charges were vague, the evidence non-existent, but the verdict had been decided long before the trial began. One by one, bishops, knights, even elderly statesmen were dragged into the public square. The executions lasted 2 days, the cobblestones slick with blood, as nearly 100 of Sweden's elite were beheaded or hanged. Among the dead was father of a young nobleman named Vasa, who watched in horror from hiding as his family's legacy was erased. This wasn't just brutality, it was political suicide. Christian had gambled that terror would cement his rule. Instead, the Stockholm bloodbath became the spark that burned the Union to ashes. Vasa, the sole surviving heir of a murdered dynasty, the peasantry and remaining nobles, painting Christian as a monster who butchered his own subjects under a flag of truce. Within 3 years, Sweden declared independence, crowning as its king. The union that had endured for over a century shattered beyond repair, not because of war or diplomacy, but because a king's betrayal turned an entire nation against him. The irony: Christian's reign collapsed almost as quickly as his victims. His cruelty alienated even his Danish supporters, and within a year he was overthrown and exiled. The bloodbath he orchestrated to secure power became the very thing that destroyed it. Meanwhile, Vasa built a new Sweden, one that would grow into a European power, all because Christian had underestimated the cost of betrayal. When you break the rules of trust so flagrantly, you don't just lose allies. You create enemies who will stop at nothing to see you fall. And in the end, the only legacy Christian left was a square in Stockholm still known as the place of the scaffolds, where the echoes of his miscalculation linger centuries later. Ambition alone didn't topple these dynasties, it was timing. Medieval betrayers were master opportunists, striking when kings were at their most vulnerable, drowning in debt, crippled by illness, or down in distant wars. Take Richard II of England, whose heavy taxes and erratic behavior alienated the nobility just as his exiled cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned to claim the throne. Or James I of Scotland, whose reforms angered the aristocracy precisely when he lacked a strong heir to deter them. Weakness was an invitation, and betrayal was the RSVP. Yet revenge played just as pivotal a role as ambition. For every nursing a grudge against his brother Harold, there was the handsome turning his Ottoman upbringing against the Impaler. These weren't cold political calculations, they were deeply personal. The Stockholm bloodbath wasn't just Christian the second consolidating power. It was a king settling scores with Swedish nobles who'd hymned for years. Revenge transformed private vendettas into national crises, proving that in the Middle Ages, the line between politics and passion was razor-thin. But the most corrosive force wasn't hatred or greed. It was the erosion of trust. Dynasties collapsed when the unspoken rules of loyalty frayed. The Knights Templar discovered this too late, realizing no amount of papal protection could save them from Philip IV's fabricated heresy trials. The Umayyids learned it when their own generals defected to the Abbasids, trading decades of service for promises of equality. Once subjects stopped believing oaths mattered, even the strongest rulers became vulnerable. The irony? The betrayers rarely fared better. Lord Stanley's switch at won Henry Tudor a crown, but it also taught the new king to distrust overmighty nobles, leading to policies that would strangle the aristocracy's power. George's Catholic nobles overthrew him in the name of orthodoxy, only to watch Hungary's bleed Bohemia dry. Betrayal wasn't a strategy, it was a toxin that poisoned everyone it touched. These stories reveal a haunting truth. Medieval power wasn't about who had the right to rule, but who had the leverage to enforce it. Thrones didn't topple because of abstract ideals. They fell because someone, somewhere, saw an opening and seized it. And in that moment of chaos, the difference between a king and a corpse often came down to one question: who still believed their promises? When the answer was no one, even the mightiest dynasties crumbled like at high tide. From thrones to graves, these betrayals remind us that history is written by the victors and the treacherous. Each act of deceit reshaped kingdoms, proving that no dynasty was invincible. What lessons can we draw? Perhaps that power corrupts, but betrayal destroys. The medieval world operated by its own brutal logic, where crowns were won not just by birthright or battle, but by the whispered conspiracy, the poisoned cup, the dagger in the dark. These stories aren't just relics of a distant past. They're mirrors reflecting timeless truths about ambition, trust, and the price of power. Consider the patterns that emerge. Time and again, the most devastating betrayals weren't orchestrated by strangers, but by those closest to the throne, queens like Isabella of France, brothers like the handsome, even children like the princes in the tower. The medieval court was a viper's nest where intimacy was the perfect disguise for treachery. And the consequences? They rippled far beyond the lives of kings and queens. The fall of the Templars destabilized Europe's financial systems. The murder of Zarevich plunged Russia into decades of chaos. The Black Dinner hardened Scotland's nobility into generations of distrust. Betrayal wasn't just personal, it was geopolitical. Yet there's a deeper irony here. Many of these betrayers ultimately fell victim to the same forces they unleashed. Richard III won his crown by eliminating his nephews, only to lose it when Lord Stanley turned on him. Christian II of Denmark thought the Stockholm bloodbath would cement his rule, but it birthed Swedish independence instead. The lesson: in the medieval world, betrayal was a weapon with no safe handle. Wield it, and you might just cut yourself. So why do these stories still captivate us centuries later? Maybe because they strip away the pageantry of monarchy to reveal something raw and human. Behind the crowns and the castles, these were people making impossible choices, sometimes for survival, sometimes for greed, sometimes for reasons we'll never fully understand. Their decisions remind us that power isn't just about who sits on the throne, but who's willing to risk everything to take it. If you found this journey into the dark heart of medieval politics fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Who do you think was history's most cunning betrayer? Until next time, stay curious and maybe watch your back. After all, as these stories prove, the most dangerous threats often come from the shadows you thought were safe.